How could a priest, purified, consecrated, trained for decades to enter the presence of God, simply collapse before he even reached the altar? Not because of weakness, not because of illness, because of glory. 1 Kings 8:10-11 records it with a precision that most churches have never stopped to examine. When the ark was brought into Solomon's temple, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, and the priests could not stand to minister. The Hebrew text uses the verb yakol, actual physical ability, not a spiritual condition. They lost motor function. The human body, in the proximity of that presence, simply could not sustain the weight of continuing to operate normally. This is not poetic language. It is a physical fact with devastating theological consequences. The Hebrew word Shekinah, which does not appear in the canonical text but is used by the Talmud, Berachot 6a, to describe this very presence, comes from the root shakan, to dwell, to settle, to establish permanent residence. The Talmud is not describing a vision, it is describing an occupation. The glory of God did not merely visit Solomon's temple, it moved in, with weight heavy enough to buckle the knees of Israel's most prepared ministers. And here is the contradiction no sermon ever resolves. If the Shekinah was so devastating to human flesh that trained priests could not remain standing, how could a human body, centuries later, carry that same glory from the inside out, without collapsing, without being consumed, without ceasing to be human? The Midrash Shemot Rabbah, commenting on the descent of the cloud over the tabernacle, records that Moses was the only man in all of Israel's history who was able to enter the cloud while it was still descending, not because he was stronger, but because God clothed him with a capacity that natural flesh does not possess. The Midrash calls it levusha shel, or a garment of light that created an interface between the human and the divine. That detail changes the entire script. Because if a supernatural covering was necessary for Moses simply to enter the cloud, what would have been required for the Messiah to become the permanent dwelling place of that glory? This video will investigate what the Shekinah actually was, not as a theological concept, but as a physical presence with documented effects on the human body. It will examine why the Holy of Holies had to be inaccessible. It will trace the moment when that glory left the stone temple and found a new dwelling, and what the Messiah's body had to endure for that to be possible. The last time the Shekinah descended upon human flesh, priests fell down. What happened when it decided to dwell in human flesh? That answer is still being hidden. It was the most anticipated day in 500 years of Israelite history. Solomon had spent 7 years building the temple, a building whose stones were cut so far away that no sound of a hammer disturbed Jerusalem during the entire construction. The priests were dressed in white. The Levites had their instruments. 120 trumpeters blew at the same time, and the book of 2 Chronicles records that the sound could be heard for miles. Everything was ready. Israel's holiest men were at their posts. Then the ark crossed the threshold of the Holy of Holies, and something no training had prepared them for happened. 1 Kings 8:10-11 leaves no room for symbolic interpretation. The cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not continue ministering because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. The Hebrew verb used for could not is yakol, the same word used when Jacob wrestled with the angel and the angel could not prevail. It is not a choice. It is objective, physical inability. The priests did not decide to stop. Their bodies simply shut down. This raises a question that church tradition rarely asks with precision. What exactly entered that space that made it impossible for human physiology to continue operating normally? It wasn't fire. The fire had appeared before without this effect. It wasn't fear. These men had spent years preparing for this exact moment. It was presence, weight, density. The Talmud Yoma 21b records a feature of the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple that defies known physics. The inner chamber measured 20 cubits, but the ark, which stood in the center, did not reduce the available space around it. The measurements didn't add up. It was as if the ark existed in a dimension that did not compete with ordinary matter. The rabbis called it the miracle of the place, the space that contains the infinite without being destroyed by it. No architect has ever explained this phenomenon. They simply recorded that it happened. Picture what the priests experienced in that moment. They didn't see a flash of light and fall. The cloud descended gradually, like thick smoke entering through every opening at once. And as it advanced, the human body gradually lost its ability to support itself. It wasn't fainting. It was as if the spiritual gravity of God's presence was heavier than any human's muscular strength. The Midrash Shemot Rabbah 2.6 offers an image the canonical text does not record explicitly. The glory that descended on the temple was the same that had filled the tabernacle in the wilderness, but now concentrated. For 40 years in the desert, the Shekinah had dwelt in a structure of wood and fabric. Now it was entering stone, cedar, and gold. The concentration increased, and with it, the weight on the flesh. Solomon immediately understood what it meant. His dedication prayer, recorded in 1 Kings 8:27, begins with a question no other monarch dared to ask, but will God really dwell on the earth? It is not polite humility. It is the confession of a man who had just watched priests collapse and realized that something greater than the temple had arrived. Solomon's question is not rhetorical. It is the echo of a man confronted with a reality that exceeded the architecture he had built. The temple was finished, but God was bigger than the temple. And that tension between the infinite and what matter can contain did not end that day. It had only begun. Because if Israel's most prepared priests could not remain standing before the Shekinah when it dwelt in stone and wood, the question the next sections will investigate is even more unsettling. How did that same glory dwell in human flesh? And what did it demand of the body that received it so it would not simply be consumed? The word is not in the Bible. That is the first fact most people miss, and that is exactly where the investigation begins. Shekinah does not appear in any canonical verse of the Old or New Testament. It exists in rabbinic texts, the Talmud, the Midrash, and the Zohar, built from a verbal root that the biblical text uses dozens of times, but which translations never stop to investigate in depth. The root is shakan, to dwell, to settle, to establish permanent residence in a specific place. It is not to visit. It is to live there. The tabernacle in the wilderness was called Mishkan, derived from the same root. The instruction God gave Moses in Exodus 25:8 was precise. Make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. The Hebrew verb there is shachanti, first person singular of shakan. God did not say he would appear, he said he would establish residence. That distinction changes the entire nature of the divine presence in the temple. The Talmud Berachot 6a uses the term Shekinah to describe the presence that rests upon an assembly in prayer, and clearly distinguishes it from a vision or a subjective spiritual state. For the rabbis, the Shekinah had location, it had weight, it had direction, it moved, it settled, and under specific circumstances, it withdrew. It was not a feeling, it was an objective presence with coordinates in space. The Zohar, in the portion Teruma, deepens this definition in a way no Western Sunday school ever taught. The Shekinah is described as the feminine aspect of the divine presence, not in the biological sense of gender, but in the sense of receptivity and indwelling. While the transcendent aspect of God remains above and beyond, the Shekinah is the aspect that descends and occupies. It is the God who becomes accessible to matter. That is why the priests fell in 1 Kings 8. When the Shekinah descended upon the Holy of Holies, it was not a visit from the transcendent aspect of God, distant, inaccessible, beyond matter. It was the aspect that dwells, that settles, that weighs upon physical space. And the human body, which was never designed to bear the full density of that indwelling, simply gave way. The Midrash Numbers Rabbah 12:4 records something that expands this even further. When the Shekinah first settled in the tabernacle in the wilderness, the 12 tribes of Israel around it felt its presence in distinct physical ways. Light, heat, a pressure on the shoulders that the Levites described as the weight of an invisible hand. It was not uniform. The presence manifested according to proximity and the function of each tribe. The closer you were, the heavier it became. That explains the entire architectural logic of the temple. It was not merely religious separation, it was a matter of graded intensity. The outer court, the inner court, the holy place, the Holy of Holies. Each barrier was not just ritual, it was a decompression chamber between ordinary human reality and the presence that dwelt at the center, like a pressure chamber protecting divers from abrupt changes in atmosphere. The Talmud Yoma 39b records a fact that closes this layer of investigation in a devastating way. In the 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, the Shekinah gave signs that it was withdrawing. The lot for Yom Kippur stopped falling on the favorable side. The crimson wool tongue on the altar stopped turning white. The doors of the temple began opening by themselves at night. The rabbis knew the presence was leaving, but they did not know where it was going. The answer to where the Shekinah went and what it needed to find in order to dwell again is what the next sections will reveal. For 40 years, 2 million people never needed to look at the sky to know where God was. He was visible, above the tabernacle, always. Exodus 13:21-22 records the phenomenon with a precision that a quick reading usually misses. A pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. The text does not say God sent a cloud. It says God was in it. The cloud was not a sign pointing to God. It was the form God's presence took in order to become visible to human perception. Two forms, one presence, one purpose. The Midrash Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, commenting on Exodus 13, identifies 7 distinct clouds surrounding Israel's camp in the wilderness, not just one. One above, 4 on the sides, one below leveling the ground, and one in front destroying snakes and scorpions. What Exodus describes as a single pillar was in Rabbinic tradition a complete supernatural environmental protection system. Israel was not merely following God's presence, they were living inside it. The nighttime fire was not decorative. Numbers 9:15-23 establishes that Israel's movement in the wilderness was determined entirely by the cloud. When it lifted, the camp marched. When it rested, the camp stopped. The decision to move 2 million people with all their belongings and animals was neither strategic nor military. It was simply watching when the presence of God moved. 40 years of obedience to the movement of a cloud. The Zohar in the portion Beshalach reveals a layer the simple reading of the text does not deliver. The cloud and the fire were not just different forms of the same presence. They were aspects with distinct functions. The cloud functioned as a filter. It made God's presence bearable to human eyes, absorbing the intensity that, without mediation, would consume. The fire was the presence unfiltered, visible only at a safe distance at night, when the darkness created contrast without proximity. The cloud protected Israel from God, not from their enemies. The Talmud Sukkah 11b discusses the nature of the clouds and records a rabbinic debate that reveals something unexpected. Rabbi Eliezer argues that the wilderness clouds were real, physical, composed of dense matter. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. They were clouds of glory, a substance that does not exist in ordinary creation, produced directly by the divine presence. The debate was never resolved, but both agree on one point. The effect was physical and documentable. The debate was not about whether the presence was real. It was about what it was made of. Picture Israel's camp at dusk in the Sinai desert, the sun setting over the sand, and above the tabernacle, the fire beginning to appear, not like an ordinary flame flickering in the wind, but a stable, vertical, motionless column, brighter than any campfire those people had ever seen. Children grew up seeing it every single night. To them, the visible presence of God was the most obvious fact of reality. Then they reached Canaan, and the cloud stopped appearing, not all at once, gradually, until the next generation grew up without seeing it. And it was that generation that had to build the temple, not because they wanted to replace the cloud, but because they needed a place where that presence could come to dwell again. Solomon did not build the temple to impress neighboring nations. He built an address for God to return to. And when the cloud descended again, upon the Holy of Holies on the day of dedication, the priests who had never seen it in the wilderness encountered the weight of what an entire generation had lost. And they could not remain standing. If this investigation is revealing layers that no translation has ever delivered, subscribe now. Each video in this series goes deeper than the last. Turn on the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. There was a chamber in the center of Solomon's temple that no one saw. Not the ordinary priests, not the Levites, not even the king himself. Only one man once a year entered, and even that man had no guarantee he would come out alive. The Holy of Holies was separated from the rest of the temple by a veil made of 4 materials: twisted linen, blue, purple, and crimson. The Talmud Yoma 71b details that this veil was a handbreadth thick, about 8 centimeters, and so heavy it required 300 priests to wash it. It was not a decorative curtain. It was a structural barrier between two kinds of reality. On the outside, the world where human flesh could function. On the inside, something different. The high priest who entered on Yom Kippur underwent preparation that began 7 days earlier. The Talmud Yoma 1a-2a records the full protocol. He was separated from his family, slept in a special chamber in the temple, spent the 7 days in study and ritual sprinkling. The night before entering, the elders kept him awake so he would not have dreams that caused impurity. Nothing was left to chance, because chance in there was fatal. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, records in Antiquities of the Jews a detail that confirms what the Talmud describes. The high priest entered the Holy of Holies with a rope tied to his ankle. If he fell dead inside, the other priest would need to pull him out, because no one else was authorized to enter to retrieve the body. A rope between life and death, tied to the ankle of the only man authorized to draw near. The Zohar, in the portion Acharei Mot, explores why this extreme protocol was necessary. The Shekinah in the Holy of Holies was not in a state of passive rest. It was in a state of active indwelling, what the Zohar calls itaruta deletata, the awakening from below to above. God's presence there was dynamic, responsive, and reacted to the spiritual and physical condition of the one approaching. A priest with impurity did not just run a spiritual risk. He ran a physical risk. The incense the high priest burned upon entering was not arbitrary ritual. Leviticus 16:13 is explicit. The cloud of incense had to cover the mercy seat so that the priest would not die. The Midrash Vayikra Rabbah 21:7 interprets this verse with unsettling precision. the incense created an intermediate layer of smoke between the priest and the direct presence of the Shekinah. It was yet another decompression chamber. Even with all the preparation, direct proximity was unbearable. There was a detail in the high priest's garment that confirms the physical nature of what happened inside. The hem of the ephod robe was adorned with golden bells, alternating with fabric pomegranates. The Talmud Yoma 42a explains the function. The bells were to sound as the priest moved, so the other priests outside would know he was still alive and moving. The silence of the bells was the signal that something had gone wrong. And all of this, the rope, the bells, the incense, the 7 days of preparation, the purification protocol, was necessary for one man to approach the ark. Not to touch it, not to open it, just to exist in the same space with it for a few minutes. What this reveals about the nature of what dwelt in the Holy of Holies is what makes the New Testament claim absolutely staggering. That this same presence decided to dwell not in a stone compartment with an 8-centimeter veil, but in human flesh, without a rope, without bells, without incense. Modern science does not have a protocol for investigating the Shekinah, but it does have language to describe what the biblical and rabbinic texts record as its effects, and that language is closer to the biblical account than any 18th century theologian would have suspected. Start with the most concrete fact: human bodies losing motor function without identifiable physiological cause in response to an invisible environmental presence. This happened in 1 Kings 8. It happened in Ezekiel 1:28, when the prophet saw the vision of the divine glory and fell on his face. It happened in Revelation 1:17, when John, the same one who had leaned his head on Jesus' chest, saw the glorified Christ and fell as though dead. It was not weakness of character. It was physiological collapse in the face of something the human nervous system was not calibrated to process. Quantum physics has introduced in recent decades the idea that ordinary matter is vastly composed of empty space, and that what we perceive as solidity is more precisely the effect of force fields resisting interpenetration. What we call physical presence is, in the language of modern physics, the interaction between electromagnetic and gravitational fields that our nervous system interprets as density and weight. If the Shekinah is a presence that transcends ordinary physical fields, the collapse of the human nervous system before it is not a metaphor. It is a consequence. Physicist Gerald Schroeder, in The Science of God, observes that biblical accounts of divine presence always involve measurable physical components: light, heat, sound, and effects on organic matter. Schroeder argues that the Jewish tradition never treated God's presence as exclusively spiritual in the sense of immaterial, but as a reality that includes physical dimensions. Our scientific instruments still lack the ability to detect or measure. The absence of measurement is not the absence of reality. The Talmud Chagiga 14b records the story of the 4 rabbis who entered the Pardes, an expression describing mystical contemplation of the divine glory. Of the 4, one died, one went mad, one apostatized. Only Rabbi Akiva entered and exited in peace. The Talmud does not explain the mechanism, it simply records the effects. 4 human minds exposed to the same contemplation, 4 radically different outcomes. The glory was not uniform in its effect, it was responsive to the condition of the one approaching. This has an interesting parallel in the physics of radiation. The same exposure to a source of energy produces dramatically different effects depending on the density, composition, and preparation of the material exposed. A conductor and an insulator exposed to the same electric current behave in opposite ways. The source is identical. The result depends on the receiver. The high priest, prepared by 7 days of purification, was a different kind of receiver than an ordinary priest. But even he needed decompression chambers, incense, and a rope. What this raises is the question that structures the rest of this investigation. Is there any configuration of human matter that could sustain the Shekinah without collapsing? Is there a human body that could be at the same time a full receiver of the glory and a functional, operating human being? Scientific tradition would say no, that the asymmetry between the infinite and the finite is irresolvable. But there is a moment recorded in the Gospels in which a human body not only sustained the glory, it radiated it through the skin, through the clothes, in front of 3 witnesses who survived to tell about it. The prologue of the Gospel of John is the densest text in the New Testament. Every word was chosen with a precision that only reveals itself when read against the backdrop of the Jewish tradition that John knew from the inside. John 1:14 says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." The Greek word translated dwelt is eskenosen, from the verb skenu, which comes from the same semantic field as the Hebrew shakan. John did not say that Jesus came to live among us in the casual sense. He said he pitched his tabernacle among us. The root is the same as Shekinah, Mishkan, and the Shakan of Exodus 25:8. John was saying, the presence that dwelt in the tabernacle now dwelt in flesh. But that immediately raises the contradiction the previous sections built. If trained priests collapse merely from the proximity of the Shekinah in the Holy of Holies, how could a human body contain it from the inside out without being destroyed? The high priest needed 7 days of preparation just to enter the space where it dwelt. Jesus dwelt in that space continuously in human form for 33 years. What made that body different from any other? The Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD formulated the answer in philosophical language: 2 complete natures, divine and human, without mixture, without confusion, without division, without separation. But that formulation, though theologically precise, does not answer the physical question. How did Jesus' human nature sustain the presence that collapsed the flesh of the priests? Rabbinic tradition, unexpectedly, offers a clue that the council did not articulate. The Midrash Shemot Rabbah 2:6, describing the call of Moses at the burning bush, records that God had to reduce the manifestation of his glory so that Moses could bear it. Like a king visiting a sick man and diminishing his magnificence so as not to crush the one who is weakened. The rabbinic term for this reduction is tzimtzum, contraction, self-limitation of the divine presence to create space where the human can exist. But in Jesus, the logic is inverted. It was not the glory that contracted to fit in the flesh. It was the flesh that was generated to be the adequate receptacle for the full glory. Luke 1:35 records the angel saying to Mary, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you." The Greek verb for overshadow is episkiase, the same root used in Exodus when the cloud of glory covered the tabernacle. Jesus' body was not formed despite the Shekinah. It was formed by it. The Talmud Sanhedrin 38b contains a rabbinic discussion about the nature of Adam before the fall, and records that some sages described his original body as clothed with or, light, not or, skin. The difference is a single letter in Hebrew, but the Midrash preserves the tradition that the original human form was luminous, compatible with direct divine presence, without need for a barrier. What the fall broke, the incarnation rebuilt in a single body. John 1:14 continues, "And we beheld his glory." They did not say we felt his presence or we experienced his power. They used the visual vocabulary of the Shekinah, the same glory the prophets saw over the tabernacle, that Isaiah saw in the temple, that Ezekiel saw by the Kebar River. The disciples, living beside Jesus, were beside the presence that had knocked the priest down in 1 Kings 8, and they remained standing. In the moment Jesus died on the cross, something happened 30 meters away, inside the temple, that no priest could explain. Matthew 27:51 records, "The veil of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom." The direction matters. A tear from bottom to top would have been the result of human force. From top to bottom, in a veil 8 centimeters thick that 300 priests struggled to carry, was impossible to produce by any physical means available. The Talmud records this event in a way the Church rarely mentions. Talmud Yoma 39b lists 5 signs that began 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, exactly the period corresponding to Jesus' ministry and death. Among them, the doors of the temple began opening by themselves at night. The fire on the altar began showing irregularities. And the most striking detail, the tearing of the inner veil of the temple, was recorded by priestly witnesses, whom the Talmud preserves without any satisfying theological explanation. The rabbis knew something had changed. They did not agree on what. The torn veil was not merely a symbolic gesture of access. It was the collapse of a structure that had been necessary because the glory needed containment. While the Shekinah dwelt in the Holy of Holies, the veil protected the priests. It was the barrier between the presence and the flesh that could not sustain it. With the veil torn, the equation changed completely. The protection was no longer necessary, or what it contained had moved. The Zohar, in the portion Vayakhel, describes the Shekinah as a reality that cannot dwell in a space marked by unjustly shed blood. When innocent blood is spilled, the Shekinah withdraws, not as punishment, but as a consequence of the incompatibility between the indwelling of glory and the moral contamination of the space. The destruction of the temple in 70 AD, 40 years after the crucifixion, is interpreted by Rabbinic tradition as the definitive withdrawal of the Shekinah from that physical space. But where did it go? The Midrash Ruth Rabbah Tube 3 preserves a disconcerting fact. When the temple was destroyed, the Shekinah did not simply disappear. The rabbis record that it drew near the ruins and remained over them, crying, in the language of the Midrash, for 3 days. The image is anthropomorphic, but the underlying point is theological. God's presence does not immediately abandon the place it once inhabited. It withdraws gradually, like someone leaving a house they loved. Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians 3:16, uses language that first-century Jews would have immediately recognized. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? The Greek verb is oike, dwells, resides permanently. Paul was not using devotional metaphor. He was making a technical statement with precise vocabulary. The Shekinah that had dwelt in the Mishkan, that had dwelt in Solomon's temple, had now found a new dwelling, not in stone, in flesh. But between the torn veil and this new indwelling, there was an event the investigation cannot skip, because it was the only moment in history when the Shekinah dwelling inside a human being visibly overflowed through the skin. And 3 men saw it. Mount Hermon rises 2,114 meters in the north of Israel. It was considered in Canaanite and Jewish tradition the boundary between heaven and earth, the place where the realms touched. Not by accident, it was there that the most disconcerting event in the Gospels took place. Matthew 17:2 describes it with an economy of words that most translations fail to capture. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. The Greek verb is metamorphothe, metamorphosis, not an external illumination, a transformation that came from the inside out. The light did not fall on Jesus, it came out of Jesus. The Talmud Shabbat 88b, describing Moses receiving the Torah on Sinai, records that his face began to radiate light. Shekinah, or rays of light. Exodus 34:29-30 confirms, when Moses came down from the mountain, his skin shone so brightly that the Israelites could not look at him, and he had to cover his face with a veil. Moses' light was derived, he had been in the presence and absorbed something that his body now radiated. Jesus' light at the Transfiguration was original. It was not absorbed. It emerged. Peter, James, and John, 3 fishermen who had seen storms, heavy nets, and the Sea of Galilee under a north wind, fell face down on the ground with their faces covered. They were not being dramatic. Matthew 17:6 says they were filled with great fear, the same vocabulary of holy terror that biblical texts use to describe the human reaction to the proximity of divine glory. The 3 saw what the priests in 1 Kings 8 had felt, and the reaction was the same. What the Transfiguration reveals is not only that Jesus was divine. The resurrection would prove that. What it reveals is that the Shekinah that had dwelt in the Holy of Holies had found a dwelling that was at the same time completely human and completely compatible with the full glory. Jesus' skin was not consumed, his clothes did not catch fire, the human body remained intact. The containment had been solved from within. The Zohar in the portion Beshalach uses the image of a lantern. The fire inside it is real, intense, capable of burning, but the glass around it creates an interface that allows the light to project without the fire destroying the surroundings. Jesus at the Transfiguration was the lantern, but a lantern whose structure had been built specifically to contain and radiate, not to be consumed. Moses and Elijah appear beside Jesus during the Transfiguration. Luke 9:31 reveals what the 3 were talking about: Jesus' exodus in Jerusalem, the death he was about to fulfill. The vision of full glory and the conversation about death were happening at the same time. The body that sustained the Shekinah was being prepared to be broken, and it was exactly in the breaking of that body, in the tearing of the veil, in the bloodshed, in the death of the only human being who had ever sustained the glory, that the equation changed for every other human body that would come after. What happened between the death of Jesus and Pentecost is what turns this investigation from history into present reality. The question is not philosophical, it is geographical. If the Shekinah dwelt in the tabernacle in the wilderness for 40 years, dwelt in Solomon's temple for 400 years, dwelt in the body of Jesus for 33 years, and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, where is that presence now? The presence that knocked down the priests, that illuminated Moses, that overflowed through Christ's skin on Mount Hermon? The Talmud Sanhedrin 39a records that the Shekinah never completely abandoned Israel, even in destruction and exile. The rabbis identified its presence over the synagogues, over communal prayer, over the study of Torah, a reduced, veiled but real presence. Talmud Megillah 29a is explicit. Wherever Israel goes in exile, the Shekinah goes with them. It does not dwell in buildings, it follows people. Pentecost, recorded in Acts 2, happened 50 days after Passover, exactly the same interval that separates the Exodus from the giving of the Torah at Sinai. It is not chronological coincidence, it is typology. The first time God descended upon Israel after the Exodus, he descended in fire upon the mountain. The second time, he descended in tongues of fire upon 120 people in an upper room. The Shekinah did not return to a building. It descended upon bodies. Acts 2.3 uses a precise image, tongues as of fire that settled upon each of them. The verb ekatison, settled, rested, established itself, is from the same semantic field as shaken. The Shekinah did not visit the upper room. It dwelt in each person present, what had been the exclusive privilege of the Holy of Holies. The indwelling of glory was democratized. 120 people became, each one, a walking holy of Holies. Paul develops this revelation in 1 Corinthians 6:19 with a precision that only reveals itself in Hebrew. Do you not know that your body is a sanctuary of the Holy Spirit? The Greek word is naos, not the outer temple, hieron, but the inner sanctuary, the chamber where the presence dwelt. Paul was not saying the believer is like the temple. He was saying the believer is the Holy of Holies. The same presence, the same indwelling, a different body. The Zohar, in the portion Vayera, records something that summarizes this entire investigation. When the Shekinah finds a worthy receptacle, prepared, purified, open, it does not merely dwell. It progressively transforms the receptacle until it can sustain ever denser layers of its presence. The process is not instantaneous. It is like metal being gradually heated until it can receive the mold. The Shekinah does not collapse its current receptacles, it rebuilds them. This radically changes the understanding of what it means to be indwelt by the Holy Spirit, not an episodic emotional experience, not a feeling of peace in moments of prayer, but the objective, physical, in the deepest sense, presence of the same glory that filled Solomon's temple and knocked its priests down, now establishing residence in ordinary human flesh. The priests in 1 Kings 8 could not remain standing because the presence arrived from the outside, suddenly, in an intensity for which there was no structural preparation. The promise of the New Testament is different. The same presence, arriving from the inside out, progressively rebuilding the receiver until it is able to sustain it, radiate it, and carry it through the world, just as Jesus did, from the Jordan to Calvary, from Calvary to the Mount of Transfiguration, from the Mount back to the streets of Galilee. The glory that knocked down the priests was not abolished, it was transferred. What this video investigated is not new doctrine. It is ancient doctrine that translations buried under layers of vocabulary that had become too familiar to still surprise. The Shekinah that filled Solomon's temple and buckled the knees of Israel's most prepared priests was not a phenomenon of the past. It was the rehearsal for something history was being prepared to receive. The Holy of Holies, with its 8-centimeter veil, the bells on the high priest's robe, the rope on the ankle, the incense as a decompression chamber, all of it was the containment system for a presence that had not yet found its definitive dwelling. The body of Jesus was that dwelling. Not because the glory was reduced to fit in the flesh, but because that flesh was generated to contain the glory without being destroyed by it. The Transfiguration was not an exception to Jesus' human rule. It was the moment when the rule was exposed. For 33 years, the skin that touched lepers, that grew weary on the roads of Galilee, that bled on Calvary, was containing what had once knocked priests down. And when that body was broken, when the veil tore from top to bottom and the containment was undone, the presence did not evaporate. It was released to dwell in what had been promised since God said to Moses, "That I may dwell in their midst." Not in the midst of stones, in the midst of people. The ark carried the law, the temple carried the ark, Mary carried the living temple, and what Jesus' death released, Pentecost distributed, without veil, without rope, without incense. The glory did not diminish, it found more addresses.